It is Thursday, October 19th, 2023. And guys, you're watching the MMA Eco Live podcast. And I'm your host, as usual, Chris Presnell, here to talk to you about all things Asian MMA and go down the schedule this weekend, take your questions, discuss various things that happened in the news this week. I'm going to get to all of it in a big show today. Of course, we've got a massive pay-per-view this weekend that I am just so excited for in UFC 294. Fights from the bottom all the way to the top that I'm just pumped for. Have you guys have that feeling when a UFC pay-per-view is coming up and it's almost like that feeling of like, just like 18 more hours or like still a whole nother day? Or you guys ever have that feeling? That's the feeling I have. And I think part of it for me is being in the US and on my specific time zone. This event starts at 7 a.m. And so I, for one, am just like really excited to like wake up and just have fights hit me just like immediately upon waking up. So excited for that. Interested in a lot of these fights. Part of it is just like seeing the different personalities and characters. There's a lot of characters on this card, a lot of them. I was getting caught up a little bit on like Sharaputdin. Can't say it. Sharaputdin. I give up. Shara Magomedov. Gosh, I can say that part, right? Yeah. But yeah, looking at some of the drama from him over the last year, got Muhammad Mokaev on the card, Khamzat Chimaev, Islam Makhachev. Overall, a lot of guys whose name ends with the letter V. Like, have you guys seen exactly like just how many fighters there are whose names end with the letter V? There's a lot. Let me just look. I know I'm kind of getting on a little bit of a rabbit trail. While I'm looking at this, subscribe to the channel. Would appreciate it. Fighters whose name ends in V. Oh, and there's some extra credit too. Fighters whose name ends with V. Islam Makhachev, Khamzat Chimaev, Magomed Ankalaev, Ikram Aliskerov, Muin Gafarov, Saeed Nurmagomedov. That's bonus because they're fighting each other. Mohammed Mokaev. Let's see. Mohammed Naimov. Victoria Dudakova kind of ends with a V because she's a woman. It ends with an A, but go ahead and count her just for fun. And then Shara Magomedov. 9 fighters whose name starts with V. And then you've got Alexander Volkanovski, name starts with a V there as well. So I don't know. Interesting times, to say the least. There's your stupid fact for the weekend. Let's see how many of these fighters win if we get a perfect 9-0 on the weekend of fighters whose names end with V. But we've got that. A lot of other stuff I'm excited for the card. Feel free to ask any of those kind of questions regarding UFC 294. If you did not see it, I released a video this week previewing the Anshul Jubli versus Mike Breeden fight. And you can check that out on my YouTube channel. It's my newest video. So there's that. And then, yeah, I think that's probably the only bit of content I'm putting out for the week is just that Anshul Jubli video. I will have by early next week on the channel a Matrix Fight Night preview. And I'll kind of go over the top 3 fights on the event and then hit other prospects on the card. Super excited for that. We've got Abdul Azim Badakshi coming back. I've got a lot of other great guys. Sanjeet Budwar versus Shyam Anand. That's like one of the best fights that could be made in India right now. So really excited for Matrix Fight Night 13. But yeah, let's get into it. Starting off, or sorry, before I get into that, if you're new, the way this works, I'll run down the schedule from top to bottom of Asian MMA events. If there's any prospects competing outside of Asia that I want to hit, I'll do that. I usually cover like the Asian fighters that are fighting on UFC events, and then I'll take your questions. So if you want to ask a question about anything, you can drop that in the chat at any time, and I will get to it. I will say that I do have to duck out just before 5 o'clock this week. So that's at the top of the next hour. So whatever's going on, I'll have to cut it short. I've got something right at 5 that I'll have to run to. But yeah, let's get into it. So One Friday Fights 37 is this Friday, tomorrow in the morning here in the US. They took a break last week because of a Thai holiday, so no Friday fights last week. So the reward for that is that we get 3 MMA fights this week instead of just 2. Usually they'll have 2 to kind of open up the card. The fights we get this week are Percival Womo Mwambi from Kenya against Kamran Ortikov from Uzbekistan. And then from the Philippines, we've got 2-0 Filipino fighter Carlo Bumina Ong against Dennis Andreev. Don't really know what to expect from Carlo yet. He's just 2-0. Hasn't really fought anyone yet, so this is still kind of a building him out fight, seeing where he's at. And then the third one, we've got Morris Bolayan, I believe he's from Armenia, fighting a Mongolian fighter that I've been kind of friends with over the last year or two, Gontago Batarchulin. I know I said I know him, but I've never actually had to say his name out loud. So, but yeah, he's signed with One Championship and interested to see how he'll do. I think he is 5-1, so pretty good prospect in Gontago. Of all the names to pronounce, Mongolians are sometimes the hardest for me to pronounce. And apparently Sharputin Magomedov is also very hard for me to pronounce. But yeah, so those are your 3 fights. Not a whole lot to say about any of those fights. But yeah, check those out on the One Championship YouTube page tomorrow. And then we've got dual Kazakh events going down this weekend as well. Alash Pride 90 and Octagon 51. Not a whole lot of like big prospects on those cards. Alash Pride, really the only fighter I'll mention on there is Sariev. That's Ruslan Sariev, and he's really the only guy I'll mention. He's a Kazakh guy fighting, and he has a 12-2 record. He lost 2 fights, and then he won his last fight by disqualification because his opponent choked him and then wouldn't let go of the choke, so he got disqualified. So it's like, yeah, technically a win, but hard to really like feel like that's a win. So, but as I looked over the card, he was really the only guy that stood out to me, Ruslan Sariev. And then on the Octagon show, they've got 2 title fights. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and you can look over that card together. So there's 2 title fights. There is in the main event, Farhad Davletov fighting Muhammadjan Kurbanov. In a time where Tajik prospects are getting a lot of big opportunities and a lot of spotlight and kind of a booming MMA market, this guy, Farhad Davletov, has a big opportunity to shine. So let's take a look at him real quick. So this will be for the Octagon featherweight belt. In his last fight, let's see what the result of that fight was. So he will be fighting for the belt. He is not the champ right now. He beat this guy Azamat in his last fight by decision. So Davletov fighting, I believe, an Uzbek guy in Kurbanov. And as we look over his record, nothing really stands out here. Kind of 2 of the better guys he fought, he lost against those guys. But nothing really that stands out right now, although he does have a lot of finishes to his record. So yeah, fighting for the Octagon featherweight belt. You got to think if he wins that, then he's going to be in a lot of public eye as well. So opportunity for a Tajik prospect to kind of make a big show. And then the co-main event, really the only other fight on the card that I'll highlight. It's the flyweight title, and Anastasia Dujikova is the current champion. She's going to be fighting Alexandra Savicheva of Russia. And you know, I mean, I gotta be honest. Like sometimes in these women's fights on the regional scene, they're kind of just taking the two best fighters that they have, not necessarily like a whole lot of like options to put together title fights. As I was looking over Savicheva's record, you know, she's 4-1, but really didn't have any like standout wins on there. She had fought in one championship. Beat Ziba Bano of India, but otherwise, yeah, not a whole lot of high quality wins on there. I guess yeah, her last fight for one championship, she lost that fight, and then has been fighting in Octagon since then. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, really, the opportunity is right there for Dujikova to make a really big statement win and kind of put herself out there as a Kazakh prospect. So that's kind of what I'll be looking for in the fight. I'll be watching it most likely live, putting out the results on my Instagram. If you're interested in that, try to get those out as quickly as I can. But yeah, just so you can kind of look over the rest of the card there. Like I said, nothing that really jumps off the page to me, at least at this point. There you got an undefeated fighter in Karim Daudov of Russia. So yeah, we'll see. All right. I guess really the only other thing that I'll get to, I saw there was a Shooto card on Sunday. You can check that out. Who's fighting on that if you're interested. Nothing really big on there, but let's get into UFC 294. The only section I have planned is to talk about Anshul Jubli, and to kind of just like give you a brief recap because I want to spend most of the time in your questions. And then I also want to cover some news that came out this week as well. But Anshul Jubli, so he's going to be fighting Mike Breeden. And basically what I saw, how I kind of see this fight going is I am picking Anshul Jubli to win this fight. How I see it going is Jubli just basically trying not to get caught in a firefight for most of the fight, and landing a lot more of the like more accurate strikes against Breeden. That's how I see it going. If Jubli has really done his homework and he has good preparation, what he needs to basically do against Mike Breeden is punish him every time the pressure is coming his way. So every time Mike Breeden, he's going to come barreling in with a lot of volume, kind of from this boxing style. If Anshul Jubli basically just throws a knee up the middle, an uppercut, a right hook, basically if you just spam him with those counters every single time he comes pressuring in, I think that he could get the stoppage later in the fight. Otherwise, I think he'll probably get a decision. But Mike Breeden, he's going to put a lot of pressure on him. He may try and wrestle Anshul Jubli. I could see that. I don't think that Jubli is totally going to be outclassed on the ground if it does go that way. Breeden does hold a wrestling advantage, but Jubli does have some pretty good grappling credentials to his name as well. So I think in just like straight up jiu-jitsu, he should be able to carry his own from there and get back up to his feet. But yeah, excited for Anshul Jubli. I did hear there was, I think, a question from the UFC 294 press conference asking about going to India. And I think the response was sort of like, yeah, not in the immediate future, but we do want to get over there. And the UFC signed Puja Tomar this week. I think there'll probably be a few more Indian fighters in the next 6 months make their way to the UFC, if not to road to UFC for next year. So if you're interested or you're wondering, well, what Indian fighters are there out there? One, watch MFN 13 coming up on, well, check out the results and highlights from MFN 13. Most likely you live outside of India if you're watching this show. Probably a few of you are in India right now, but otherwise pretty much impossible to watch Matrix Fight Night if you live outside of India. You have to check the highlights or the YouTube videos after the fact. And also check out the latest or second to latest video I put on my channel about the top 10 Indian fighters right now. All of those fighters, and I'm excluding Anshul Jubli for the sake of like who could get into the UFC, who's next to join the UFC, and Puja Tomar was one of those. All of those fighters are kind of like in that like maybe close to elite level, like they're either good enough to get into the UFC or just like a couple fights away. So they're the best Indian fighters that I could find, at least in terms of like probably the most immediately ready to go to somewhere like the UFC. Not saying that they should all be signed right away, but you know, the 10 best guys. So yeah. And then I saw some media talking today about like quality of fighters in India, and I mean, I wouldn't say that there's like tons of fighters ready for the UFC right now, but what you have to look at is how quickly it's developing and how quickly like for a long time India has been this place with just lots of very low level fights, no really high level gyms, and a lot of fraud going on in some of the fights. And that is so quickly changing. You've got a lot of great Indian fighters going to train abroad, mostly in like Soma Fight in Bali, Indonesia is kind of where I would say there are more high level Indian fighters at Soma Fight now than anywhere else in the world. You've got Matrix Fight Night, and then like slowly some like lower level places, promotions that are like at the very least putting on reputable fights. So that's an advancement with how quickly India is growing. Like if you think about how the UFC handled China, yeah, they went to mainland China for the first time in 2017. But even when they did that, they didn't really have a lot of they if you remember, they signed a ton of Chinese fighters to fight on that card. They did not have a whole lot of Chinese fighters before that to put on in there, or definitely no like stars from China at that time. Like when they had their first Chinese event, Zhang Weili wasn't even in the UFC at that point. And that was the event that they like signed Yan Xiaonan, Song Yadong, a couple other fighters, and a lot of Chinese fighters that you can think of weren't in the UFC at that time either, didn't even fight on that card. So if they went to India, it would probably be sooner than a lot of people expect them to, but they would probably sign a couple more Indian fighters from like Matrix Fight Night. If they went there, it would kind of be like just to get their foot in the door. But like, if you remember, if we're talking about like all of Chinese territories, they went to Macau in what was that, like 2010, 2009, like a way long time ago. So wouldn't surprise me if they tried to put something together sooner rather than later. We've heard about Indonesia hopefully going there next year as well. That kind of seems like a similar situation where it doesn't necessarily strike you as like a region like ripe with UFC level talent, but like the fan base is there. I'm telling you guys, like some people always tell me like, oh, MMA isn't that popular in India right now. But I'll tell you, like when I put videos out on Indian MMA, they do really well. Like some of the best performing videos that I put out. Granted, like I've kind of like built up an audience for that. So I'm kind of just like pitching it, throwing a softball right to my audience. But there are several Indian MMA fighters that have way bigger, like if you're just looking at social media followings, there are Indian MMA fighters that have bigger followings than some UFC champions, at least on Instagram. Like Anshul, I just looked at this today, guys. Anshul Jubli has like almost 500K Instagram followers. Puja Tomar is up there too. So check this out. UFC flyweight champion Alexandre Pantoja has 169K Instagram followers. You want to know who has more than that? Ritu Fogat, 1.1 million. Just under that, but Angad Bisht, the MFN flyweight champion, 136,000 followers. Anshul has 488,000. Hasn't even made his UFC debut yet. Pooja Tomar has 408,000 followers. Hasn't fought in the UFC yet. So I mean, I'm telling you, there is a fan base in India. They could sell out an arena easily. The fan base is there. It may not have the like mainstream appeal just yet, but it's very quickly growing. I think that's what you got to look for, is that growth. So that's a good segue kind of into that Asian MMA news. I got a peek of the questions coming up, and I saw first question was about Pooja Tomar, and I'll cover that in a second. So just kind of going down the list of Asian MMA news this week. Pooja Tomar, MFN strawweight champion. You saw that she was signed to the UFC, and also I will say the first MFN champion that has gone to the UFC, and the first fighter from Matrix Fight Night to get signed directly to the UFC. Anshul Jubli went through Road to UFC and then won that, earned his way there. Pooja Tomar is the first fighter to go directly from MFN to the UFC. Something I'm very interested to see is, first of all, Matrix Fight Night has said that they don't want to just become a feeder league to bigger promotions, which is interesting. And they've demonstrated that with their contracts. A lot of their contracts, as far as I know, they put out something last year or earlier this year saying that all their contracts would be like 3-year contracts, which is pretty crazy. But it would not surprise me if they are not that willing to let a lot of their champions go, especially, or their top fighters and prospects. So I was very interested to see Pooja Tomar going directly to the UFC like that, signing. And in her post, she said, "I had Aisha Shroff and MFN's blessing on this." I don't know if it's going to be like that for every single MFN champion or prospect, but I was glad to see that it's interesting as a promotion, and you're really seeing, if you want evidence of this, look at Invicta FC, guys. The UFC, just to say it bluntly, has pretty much decimated Invicta FC. Every single fighter that is any like halfway good with Invicta FC goes straight to the UFC, and Invicta they've never really been able to like build their brand in that way. And LFA too, but like LFA, that's what they want. That's what they're there for. I don't know if Invicta necessarily that's like been their goal. They used to be on UFC Fight Pass, no more. So yeah, MFN doesn't want to just be like that, where it's like we're just gonna basically be a place for future UFC fighters to get experience. They want to be their own brand. They want to build stars within their own country. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting to see that Pooja Tomar had gone to the UFC. So saw that. Huang Yuele is going to fight Reginaldo Vieira at WLF MMA 69 on October 27th. I did see that, and I posted that earlier this week. Brave CF going back to Jakarta on November 25th. Probably going to have a lot of Indonesian fighters on that card, but haven't heard anyone confirmed. Wang Tong winning at UAE Warriors 45. Pretty like convincing unanimous decision. Looked really good. A lot of people hailing her as the next star out of China. Yeah, she's got to get to work. She's got to stay healthy and just keep taking fights and fight better and better opponents. Still only has 3 pro fights. I say give me 2 more fights against I would say in her next 2 fights, give her like the toughest prospects, the toughest flyweight prospects that you can find that aren't in the UFC. Let's put her up against those. Let's see how good she really is, and let's not mess around. Let's get her into UFC. So let's put her against the toughest that we can find. That's what I say for Wang Song going forward. But yeah, brilliant striking display, threw the kitchen sink at her at Hedaya. So looked good. I mean, we all pretty much saw the same thing there. Let's see. So UFC Shanghai, still no official announcement, but from what I know, they're still looking to find an opponent for Song Yadong. We did get 2 more ranked bantamweights on the table from this last weekend, both Jonathan Martinez and Chris Gutierrez. I know they're like in the like 10 to 15 range, but they did win this last weekend. I'll be interested to see if the UFC tries to get any of either of those 2 guys, but it just seems like they've had a lot of trouble finding another ranked strawweight or bantamweight for Song Yadong to fight. Yeah, it's like if there was someone that was just like right, like they've already talked to all the guys right around him. I've heard Umar Nurmagomedov probably not going to come back until March, so not a whole lot of options. I mean, people have thrown out like Dominic Cruz and Pedro Munoz. I don't know if Cruz, seems unlikely for him to be the guy that's the B-side going over to China and like just kind of, I don't know, volunteering himself to be the guy for Song just to beat up on at home. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like the kind of fight that Cruz will take at his point in his career, and I don't blame him. So yeah, I mean, there's Pedro Munoz. We'll see. I don't know what's going to happen with that. I did hear even if they can't find a fight for Song Yadong, we're still going to have the event in Shanghai. So I would guess they'll probably just try to find like some non-Asian fighters potentially ranked and put them together for a main event if Song can't do it. So that's what I think will happen. But I do feel like I think that it's a lock for Shanghai, even if they can't figure out what to do. But I will say that as soon as this card is announced, you're going to hear a ton of hate from fans and media, because as far as I know, this card has like no, like, I mean, for us, we know these names. Yeah, sure, I'll be excited for it, but there's just like no, I mean, you think about the Singapore card, they made a pretty good card with that, but a lot of that was because they got fight. I mean, they had like Aaron Blanchfield versus Tyler Santos, Giga versus Alex Caceres. Like they were able to get some other fighters on there, but yeah, I mean, so we had Nasrat Haqparast versus Jamie Malarkey announced this week. I broke the news of Park Sung-hyung versus Shannon Ross. And then, so yeah, we've got 5 fights official. And then the Road to UFC fights, if those are all finalized, that brings us up to 9. Kevin Jousset, a French fighter that trains out of City Kickboxing, he has posted this week that he's going to be fighting on the card. He's a welterweight, and I've been asking around. It's been hard to get a solid answer. Some of these folks are not always very responsive, but I've been wondering if he's going to be fighting Song Kanan at that card. That would make a lot of sense. There's no other Asian welterweights aside from like Li Jingliang that he could fight. So if he's fighting another Asian fighter, it's either going to be Song or Li. So there's that. But otherwise, there's really only room for like, so that brings us up to 10. If Song Yadong and Li Jingliang are on the card, that brings us up to 12. Most UFC cards are 13. Really just room for one more fight there. So yeah, this card's going to get a ton of pushback from fans of just, I don't know who any of these people are. This is a terrible fight card. Okay, well, it also airs at like 1 in the morning your time. So were you really gonna get up and watch it anyways? Like, come on. And what we got like 40 UFC cards a year. The week after we've got UFC 296. The week before we've got UFC Austin, which is like one of the best fight night cards ever put together. So I don't know. I get tired when people complain about like a card like this that's tailored to a certain market and it's like sandwiched in between like two really really good cards. I'm just like, whatever, you weren't going to wake up and watch the card anyway, so you know, whatever. um yeah, who knows, interested to see if we'll get some kind of announcement in Abu Dhabi this weekend about UFC Shanghai. We'll see. It's like it has gone so quiet, right? Like there's all of the fights left to announce for the rest of the year are the Shanghai card. I saw a rumor. I don't know. I hate to call it a rumor if it is like legit, but for Dan Hooker against Bobby Green, main eventing the UFC Austin card. That let me just. I don't. I feel bad not saying who has posted that. If that was Bobby Green and Dan Hooker. See if we've got anything else on that. I found it interesting that no like mainstream media sites posted about that today. Magic M MMA Bets reporting that Dan Hooker versus Bobby Green will headline UFC Austin. So we'll see. Like I said, no like mainstream media outlets have posted about that today. So maybe it just means that it's not quite done or ready to report. So we'll see. We'll see about that. But yeah, other than that, what else happened this week in Asian MMA? I think I had one more thing I wanted to cover. Oh, that was basically it. Okay. Let's get to your questions and get through as many of these as we can in the next 30 minutes. So asking about why did the UFC sign Pooja Tomar? She literally threw Stamp Fairtex down and gave up on her own back. Yeah, the thing we all hate, right? When Stamp just started MMA, it's fair to say that she's not that good. So here's the thing about Pooja Tomar. I saw a lot of negativity about the UFC signing her earlier this week. Mainly, a lot of people saying they're just trying to get into Indian MMA. It's the only reason she got signed. The other thing is that she went 1-3 with one championship. And here's a few caveats I'll put to that. First off, one championship threw her against when let me actually just pull up her record real quick. I think that it's a little bit unfair for us to totally judge her UFC signing off of her run in one championship. And I'll tell you why. All right. So Pooja Tomar holds an 8-4 record, which is not that flashy. But her losses come against pretty good fighters, or at least like, so you can see, I pulled up on the screen here. Look at the fighters that Pooja Tomar has lost against. Tiffany Teo, who recently submitted Ritu Phogat, pretty good fighter with one championship. Jean Radzuan, also coming off a win in one championship. And Stamp Fairtex, who is now the one atomweight champion. So 3 pretty decent fighters that she lost to in one championship. Since then, she has won 4 straight, gone 4-0 with Matrix Fight Night, and her last 3 fights she won by TKO. So yes, she went 1-3 in one championship, but she is 4-0 in her last 4 fights, and with 3 stoppages. I know the the first two of those fights are against, lower level fighters. But oh man, that Tenzin Pema finish was pretty impressive and crazy. And then she beats two like pretty decent fighters in B Win and Anastasia Feofanova. The other thing is that she is a far better fighter than she was when she fought one championship. Since then, she has made a lot of big changes to her training. She moved to Soma Fight, trains with Anshul Jubli, trains under Coach Mike. One of the like emerging MMA gyms in Asia right now. Only been around for like 2 years. So I think she's way better than she was when she fought in one championship. Does that mean that she is UFC level? I think that she is either. I think that there are UFC strawweights that Pooja Tomar can beat. So, with that being said, yes, I guess she is. Is she able to beat anyone like in the top like 25, 30 in the UFC strawweight division? I'm not totally sure yet. We'll have to see. The other thing is people saying UFC just trying to get into India. Yeah, they're trying to build their fan base, but it's not like they're like going to India anytime soon. It's not like they're signing her to put on a card in that region. I would expect maybe we could see her on like an Abu Dhabi show. Maybe probably I'd say it's unlikely that she gets on the Shanghai card. They probably already have that card full. I don't know. Maybe they'll put her on the Riyadh card. I don't know how Saudi Arabia feels about putting women on cards. I mean, you look at a lot of these Abu Dhabi shows, they're not particularly like, not a lot of women on those cards. It's also not like any women that come from the Dagestan region. So maybe that's part of it. But yeah, basically, I think it's worth trying out. I mean, you see the UFC sign fighters from certain regions all the time to kind of just see where they're at. Pooja and Ritu are the two best women out of India right now. So I'm totally fine with the signing. There's far worse fighters that the UFC has signed. When the UFC signed a 3-0 American girl from Contender Series. So there's people complaining about Pooja Tomar, but there are definitely worse fighters with worse records that the UFC signs off of Contender Series. And I know we complain about that too, but that's how I feel about Pooja Tomar. Her striking is pretty good. I'll say that. Grappling, I mean, yeah, you're right about the Stant Fairtex thing, but we'll see. Wanted to follow up on a question I had from last week. Talked about how anyone can lose, but why does media outlets always need to make a fighter out to be unstoppable? Why don't they understand the concept that anyone can lose, and that's what makes the sport interesting to talk about? And it's the team that prepares the best. Would have to have an example from that. Yeah, I would have to have an example. Hey, had to block the. Okay. There you go. Offensive language, offensive profile pics will be auto banned. I trust my mods, guys. Appreciate it. Now for the fun question, what was your favorite Genki Sudo walkout and fight? Which walkout of his was as good as his performance? Okay, what was the one? See, this is the thing is I remember the walkouts, but I don't even remember the fight that connected to that walkout. I'll literally just go and like look up just the walkout and then won't even watch the fight. That's how cool they were. It was the one. It was like a very, I don't even remember which one it was. I tried to briefly look it up on YouTube, but I don't want to waste your all's time. It was the one, it was like a very tribal looking walkout. And he was like imitating a clock and the whole thing with like a bunch of people standing in a line behind you and then they're like popping out on each side. I don't remember which fight that was, but that still is just like mesmerizing to me. that's when like, okay, when people have like walkouts today and people are like, oh my gosh, this walkout was the best thing ever. Like they walked out to this song and it was so cool. Like, okay, fine. You're walking out to Zombie. You got emotional. That's great. Not going to take that away from you. But like, okay. And it's like, okay, Stamp Fairtex comes out doing like a TikTok dance. Fine. But like, these are the walkouts that no, like MMA fans nowadays just totally like, you don't realize what you are missing with these kind of walkouts that were just so artistic and like you're like, I don't even know what I just watched. So cool. But that's the one. Whichever fight that was is the Genki Sudo walkout that like sticks with me the most for sure. How come in MMA betting shows nobody discusses who fighters prepare with, what camp they are in, etc.? I heard this from Ghost, but past results from a fighter are not promises of future performances. And is that a statement I disagree with? So, like betting shows, here's what a lot of them do. They are just looking at fighters on paper, which in some ways that's what I do sometimes. If I have the time, I'll do the additional tape study research, looking at intangibles, things like that. But a lot of times, like a betting show, what they're doing is they're just looking at a fighter's stats and ignoring all those other things. That's kind of just what they're doing, and they're making the best picks that they can based on the stats, how things line up in that way. But that's why, and this honestly kind of goes back to the Pooja Tomar question, is like a lot of people can judge her off of her performance in one championship. And the other thing about those performances, is that when she fought Tiffany Teo, she was just 3-1. That was only her 4th pro fight. So like, it's also like really earlier in your career as well. So that's why I'm like a little bit more hesitant to judge her off of those performances. And it's like, yeah, now she trains with a totally different team, has totally different training partners, has a different coach. Usually to really see the effects of being with a team, it's not gonna really kick in until their like 3rd, 4th fight. So there's that side of it, but that's what I think a lot of betting shows are doing, is they're just like comparing stats basically. Can you elaborate on fraud in MMA? You mentioned fraud in Korean MMA. What exactly does that mean? So yeah, fraud, it kind of happens in different ways, but we've seen this honestly even from the UK a little bit in previous years. Fraud in Indian MMA. I do have some experience looking at this firsthand, actually, with my job with Tapology, because like what we do in Tapology is we'll analyze a fight to basically see if it's legit or not. So what does legit mean? For a fight to be legit and for us to count it on a fighter's record, basically there just needs to be nothing fishy going on. If you have a fighter, so what a lot of fighters will do in India is, and I know, like, I'm not saying everyone in India does this, but what would happen a lot is that fighters would basically just, they're there to entertain the fans. And so they may be fighting under a different name, or a really good fighter may fight against a fighter that his job is basically just to come in and lose. So fixed fights, that's what I mean by fraud. And what we found was that in really, really low level shows, you would have a fighter where the name of the fighter does not match up to what that fighter looks like, or the picture of the fighter that's shown on screen does not match the fighter that walks out, or there's a name change. So there was a little bit of this going on with like Sumit Kumar. And Sumit is now training with Team Alpha Male and hopefully going to be fighting in the States now. So hopefully it should be straight and narrow for him going forward. But early in his career, he fought against some fighters that would do this thing where they would like change their name so that they wouldn't take a loss and basically just like hand Sumit the win. So then, kind of works out well for everybody. And my good friend, I'm pulling up this post that I have saved on Instagram where he talks about this. My good friend Raul, who is the commentator for Matrix Fight Night, he has a post where he basically lays out the evidence for this. And he literally interviewed the fighter that Sumit fought against and has a picture of him. And like on Sumit's record originally, he had fought a guy named Prakash Raut. And the thing is that there is no such fighter named Prakash Raut. That was a fake name by a guy named Mukul, who changed his name to Prakash Raut. So basically, this goes on in Indian MMA. So when I'm watching one of these fights looking for fraud, what I'm seeing is, are there a lot of big exaggerated movements that would maybe look more like what we think of as like a martial arts movie, where every single action is really dramatic. And does it look like both fighters are in there to compete to a competitive standpoint? Does it look like this event is being overseen with like integrity? So you have to have a careful eye to look at that. And there's honestly been, like I said, even this going on in the UK as well. I wouldn't say Korea really has fraud like that, but maybe what you're referring to is just more politics going on in Korea. But that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fraud. And you think about how much that holds back. That like directly holds back MMA talent from developing in a country. That's been the biggest reason why Indian MMA is not more developed than it is because of that fraud. And Matrix Fight Night trying to push back as hard as they can against that. My friend Raul, who's been one of the biggest like proponents of exposing that fraud, he got hired by Tapology to basically be the guy to like put in results, be able to evaluate things, because he knows everybody in Indian MMA. He can see these things from a mile away. So he's like the perfect guy to bring in to have a records company evaluate what's truth from fiction. So really interesting stuff. I find that whole thing really interesting, and hopefully we get to a day where that's all history. I'm gonna try and get as many of these as I can going forward. I only have about 10 minutes before I'm gonna have to duck out. Funny that both those Indians are from Soma. Well, I mean, that's where the best Indians are right now. Like Angad Bisht trains there. There's some other pretty good Indian fighters coming up that train at home in India as well, but definitely like the biggest concentration. And like Matrix Fight Night has a very strong relationship with Soma Fight as well. Really hasn't that, yeah, local Indonesians really haven't taken that gym seriously yet. I mean, there is a reason they have 2 UFC fighters. Just give it time. It's still a newer gym. Would you consider Kanako Murata a good fighter? I bring this up since weird JMA fans keep saying that Whaley would have lost to her in 2018. Now we can make fun of him since Murata loses to. Well, that's what I was saying is like a couple weeks ago before they fought, I was saying, I think Murata's going to win, but like every time I think Vanessa Demopoulos is going to lose, she like overperforms. So maybe it was a little bit of ring rust. I do think Murata is a good fighter. I watched her compete in Invicta FC, and she was really, really good on the ground. She really was. She just like she's just had something missing from her UFC run. I don't know what it is. Just like, can consistency, maybe it's coaching. I don't know what it is, but I think that she has the tools to be a good fighter, and her grappling is exceptional, but she hasn't put everything together yet, for sure. Yeah, thanks for that. Would like to see you do the same for the rest of the road to UFC. Yeah, it's definitely on the table for sure. Now that Park has his fight announced, and Jekka a couple weeks ago has a fight announced for sure. What does feeder league mean? It means that feeder league is like, it's a gatekeeper promotion where a feeder league has really no way to keep fighters in their organization. So you think about, they are the connector from like the bottom of MMA, of like unknown amateur fighters and fighters that compete in a CrossFit gym, like they are the connector between like that bottommost level and the elite level. And they're basically there just to like pass the fighters through to the top level and to get fighters more experience. So LFA is an unashamed feeder league. And another distinguishing characteristic of that, is that they have no intention or way to keep fighters for themselves. So like LFA is not going to build their brand off of like a fighter. Like, who's an LFA champion right now? I don't even know who the LFA champions are. That's like how much of a feeder league they are. But I mean, because didn't LFA just say that they've sent like 300 fighters to the UFC? Crazy. I used to watch almost every LFA event and do a lot of their results. I used to be a lot more familiar with them, but now not so much. So like, okay, so earlier this year, Sabina Mazo fights and wins the LFA flyweight belt. The LFA is not going to be like, yeah, we're going to keep Sabina Mazo under our roster as long as possible. We're going to build her into this big star, and we want to keep her here as long as we can. That's not what the LFA is there to do. Whereas One Championship, they want to do that. Bellator, they're going to fight to keep people under their roster. Obviously, UFC does that. But there was like a time where it was like, Invicta was like, yeah, do we want to do that, or are we going to try and build people up here? And part of that is like Invicta cannot, at this point, they can't offer fighters more money than the UFC. They just can't. So there's that. But so what MFN has tried to do is be like, okay, we're going to try and put like a 3-year thing or 2-year thing into our contracts, so that it's not even about someone else offering us more money, but we do want to like build a brand off the backs of these fighters. We want fans to be able to recognize, like, we want fans from India to be able to show up an event and know who all these fighters are. That's what they want to do. LFA has built themselves more just off of the LFA brand, as like, we're just like the NCAA. We're the place you go to see the MMA's future stars. That's what we are. They're not building themselves off of X fighter, That's what feeder league is. So yeah, Pooja now, Abdulazim Badakshi could be the next. I mean, he's literally the husband of the head of the promotion. I think they're dating, but that could smooth things out for him at the UFC. While it's great in promotional point of view for fighters, it's different. OFC, they still want to catch that UFC contract most of the time. I feel like anything can get loosened up a bit after, Well, yeah, so Badakshi, I did some research on him, some tape study on him today, so I'll cover him in the video for MFN next week. Yeah. But yeah, I do think it does help. I think MFN right now does have a decent relationship with UFC. Let's see how things shake out for them for sure. Do I know if the Yoza kick, which is a rear leg front kick to the opponent's rear leg? I don't. I'm not familiar with that kick. I'll have to learn more about that. Sorry. Oh, I just being a goof. Big old goof. With just a few minutes left, I'm going to try and get to all the ones that are on the screen right now. Probably not going to go on any tangents. Want to ask, why is Western audience so obsessed with Zhang versus Yang? If you look at CMA, most Chinese fans don't want to see it since they don't think Yang is very good. I think it's a rankings thing, and it's a China versus China thing. I think that's why. And UFC going to China, perfect fight. I think that's why. If Chinese MMA isn't interested in Zhang versus Yan, who is the UFC selling that to? Fair question. Do you find it funny how one will play up Meng Bo beating Zhang Weili? Yeah, literally in their very first fights, right? Yeah, I mean, I think we all know that. Why? Okay, first off, why is Meng Bo not getting a title shot? Why? Why is she fighting Ayaka Miura? Like that fight makes no sense to me. Meng should be fighting for the belt next. If anything, this should be for like an interim belt or something like that. That division is so stagnant. And again, and maybe I'm like going right into the previous question, China versus China fight. Like these are clearly the two best fighters in the division. Xiong Jingnan has not defended her belt in a long time. I don't know what's going on with One Championship's women's divisions. They just seem to be treading water and going nowhere. I don't know. Probably too soon, but final Road to UFC is coming up. Do you see another Road to UFC coming next year? Maybe. Yes, but Indonesian fighters. That's going to be hard. I don't think there's going to be as many Indonesian fighters this year. Also, Indian fighters. If UFC can't get Indian fighters from Matrix Fight Night, then it could be tough. Like you could fill it out with Chinese fighters, Japanese fighters, Korean fighters, sure, but it's just going to be more of that. So that's my biggest question: are we going to see Indonesian fighters and Indian fighters? So I think it'll depend on that, but I do think they're going to keep Road to UFC going for sure. I think they want to keep that. After how successful last season was and this season, I think they're going to produce some really good fighters as well. For them to call that off, I think there would have to be some diminishing returns. But yeah, I'm not sure about Indonesia and India next year. All right, I've got to duck out. Was able to just glad I was able to answer all those questions. Appreciate you guys hopping on, and yeah, let's see Anshul Jubli this weekend. So pumped for this pay-per-view fight card. For me, coming at you from Portland, Oregon. Hope you have a great weekend and enjoy the fights.